Yet? Are we feeling all right? I know the workload now officially starts to pick up. I talked to somebody yesterday who was taking I think like an 8-week course, and they're like, yeah, so I have a midterm on Friday. I was like, that is just not the right way to end your second week of school. I am with you guys. My school schedule is very different than y'all's. I'm actually in finals week right now, so it's like you guys are still cruising and I'm like heading into the finish line. But I'm excited to be back. I'm glad. I'm like one of those weird people who's very glad that school is back, mainly because you guys are back around. And I don't have much to do when everybody leaves for the summer. But if you guys are new, or maybe it's your first time in a long time, my name is JD. It is really an honor to serve as the Crosstalk pastor. Last week, we kind of kicked off the semester and we started a series on the book of Genesis. Now, Genesis very broadly, we talked about this last week, is a book of beginnings. It's about the beginning of the world. It's about the beginning of the ordering of humankind. It's about the beginning of the nation of Israel. Now, any of you guys who have ever tried a Bible in a year plan or spent time trying to read the Bible on your own, knows that the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis are what we call the creation narrative. And really the fall narrative is Genesis chapter 3. But Genesis stands at the beginning of our Bibles because creation is such a fundamental theological category for the rest of the biblical narrative. Now, what that means is that only in relationship to creation can all of God's subsequent action throughout the biblical narrative actually begin to make sense for us. It only makes sense if we start at the beginning, the ordering of the world, how God created and desired for this world to be. The creation and the fall narrative are critical for us as believers to understand because they shape the way in which we view and understand God, ourselves, and the people around us, the other people that we interact with in this world. And so reading this narrative is really an exercise in what I would call self-understanding. It's an exercise in self-understanding. The stories that we read become a vehicle through which we begin to learn and understand our identity as children of God, created in His image. We talked about how we are going to approach these chapters topically, meaning that we're going to go through and we're going to pull out very specific theological concepts and we're going to focus on those during our time together each week. And by doing so, what we're doing is we're developing the tools that we need to put in our theological tool belt so that when we go back out into the world, we are formed by a biblical worldview. In other words, they are categories that frame and shape the way in which we interact with and view the world around us. Those categories, very briefly, were that God created. The very first sentence of the Bible declares that God created and ordered the world, that He is the one who sustains it. The world is not some grand cosmic accident, but it was very intentional. It's incredibly intentional. So we see that God created. We also see that what God created is good. We see that in Genesis 1:31 that God saw everything that He had created and He called it actually very good. And this view of creation, of us as human beings being created as good, stands against this very pessimistic worldview that human beings are what's wrong with the world, that we are the ones who are ruining it. What we see is that this was not God's design, that this is not how He intended it to be. He created it and it was very good. Now, He not only created it good, but it also demonstrates for us that human beings are created in God's image. This is the Imago Dei. It's Latin for image of God. At the beginning of the world, God defined our worth so that sinful human beings wouldn't be responsible for determining the value of a human life. We are not responsible for determining the value of another human being's life. When we look at others as being created in the image of God, that changes the way we understand the value of the people that we interact with on an everyday basis. From conception to death, human beings have dignity, they have eminence, and they have significance because they are made in God's image. So we see that God created, that He created it good, that human beings were created in His image. We also see that male and female He created them. Genesis 1:27 points this out for us. It literally says, male and female, he created them. And this demonstrates for us that gender was a part of God's ordering of the world. Gender was a part of God's ordering of the world. Biological sex in every individual is one aspect of God's design that proclaims his creativity, that proclaims his image, his divine image in every human being. The distinct features of every individual reminds us that no life is ever interchangeable, replaceable, or worthless. And lastly, we see that we're broken. Genesis chapter 3 is this entire narrative about how sin enters the world. Now, where did sin come from? Well, very simply, the first two human beings, Adam and Eve, are told that they can eat of every tree in the garden except for this one tree, that is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, what do? They eat of that tree. And so sin enters the world, and what that did is it disrupts the perfect relationship and fellowship that human beings had with their Creator, God. And now, this is a problem that we all deal with. We all have a sin nature, which is very simply the tendency to want to do the wrong thing. We can think of it in that way. And when we act on that, our actions, our words, and our thoughts miss the mark. And what it does is it causes harm to us and to others and to the world around us. Sin does not happen in a vacuum. It always affects those around us. Now, these 5 theological truths that we just outlined frame the way in which we think about and view God. And this week, what we're going to do is we're going to begin by unpacking the first of those, which is that God created. That God is the creator of this world, that he is the sustainer of this world. When I was a little kid, my parents enrolled me in these art classes on Saturday mornings at, it was the Columbus College of Art and Design. And so I got to be a part of, as a little kid, these art classes, and I got exposed to all of these different forms of art. I learned how to throw clay for the very first time. I was making pottery. I learned how to weave, and so I made like all of these coasters for my parents' house growing up. And we did a lot of like mixed media stuff and painting, but what I really fell in love with was drawing. And it was the use of charcoals and the way that it really could create these unique black and white images. And this love of art really translated into college as well. I took a couple of drawing classes and then decided I just didn't have enough time for it because they tell you it's like a 3-hour class, but the reality is you spend like 20 hours outside of class making something come together. It's just not well advertised in any way. But all of this has led up to this great appreciation for art. All of this exposure has caused me to have this deep love of going to museums, of going to galleries, of interacting with artists, looking at their work. And for me, the art that I love most is landscapes. I love landscapes. And I think it's because it's so difficult to do it extremely, extremely well. It is really difficult to do landscapes. It's something that I've never even begun to feel competent in creating for myself. And so when I see it done well, it is something that stirs an emotional reaction inside of me. Years ago, I had the chance to go to the Met in New York. And I was there with my family, and we came upon this room. And this room it was basically at the time, a room full of landscapes. And so they had all of these Van Goghs and these Monets and these Cézannes and these Pizarros, and I was just like in love. And I just had this moment where actually I was just emotional. I couldn't leave that room. And then I look up and it's been a half hour and my entire family is gone, and I'm like the little kid in Target who can't find his mom, just wandering around. Are you guys here? But the one that I fell in love with, the one that I just couldn't stop staring at was this painting. Now this guy, his name was Albert Bierstadt, came over from Germany and he began painting landscapes in America. And for some reason there's something about this that just completely captures me. Now, this is the mountains outside of Lander, Wyoming, which is a place that I've spent a decent amount of time. And so maybe that's why it captures for me this different era, this different time period of a place that I found very near and dear to my heart. Now, I also have the same sort of reaction, and it's different for everybody, but for me, it's when I'm in really big, unforgiving places. Places where the environment and the landscape could easily end my life, quite frankly, where it's like, oh my gosh, this place is so awe-inspiring and it's so grand. And it gives me this profound sense of how small I am and how big God actually is in that space. And I'm drawn into this deep, profound understanding that this is the God, that the God of the universe is the one who created this, and that he is mindful of me, individually and personally, that he knows me. Now, there's a key difference between something like a Utah landscape or any other wild place for that matter, and the painting that you guys saw. In a painting, the artist is creating something. They're using all of their skills, they're using all of their experience, and they're drawing upon that to bring something to life in a really profoundly beautiful way. And I think that in a lot of ways, this is the closest that we can get in human expression to this theological truth of God as the creator. But the artist is always creating and drawing upon something that is already created. Now, when we stand in these incredibly beautiful and awe-inspiring places, we come to this realization of God as the ultimate creator, that he brought this world into being, something that we could never do, bringing something out of nothing. We don't have the power or the capability. All of our acts of creation and creativity are small expressions and representations of God's creative power. Now, for some of you guys are creative. You love art in whatever that looks like, whether that's writing, whether that's painting, whether it's digital. You guys love these things. And it causes this stirring inside of us that's supposed to draw us back to God. In the same way that when we go to beautiful places, whether it's just down the road or whether we fly across the country or across the world, we have these awe-inspiring emotional reactions. And what we will see today is that when we participate in those activities or we visit those places, they demonstrate for us the Creator God. And that's what we're supposed to see when we open the biblical narrative. The first thing we need to recognize when we read the biblical narrative is that God is the principal protagonist in the Christian story. God is the principal protagonist in the Christian story. He is the main character. We are not the main character. The Bible is not about us. It is about God. Now, the second main character is creation. And the first verse of the Bible demonstrates this relationship. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In Christian thought, there is no more fundamental distinction than that between creator and creature. There's no more fundamental distinction than that of creator and creature. And there's so much that rides on this theologically. The central problem is that we, the creature, human beings, have become the antagonist in the story. We as humanity, God's representatives here on earth, do not always consider ourselves as part of the dependent creation, but we have sinfully declared our own independence from God. We want to be the God of our own universe. And so what I want us to see tonight is that this well-defined theology of creation is essential for the foundation of all of our Christian thought. It helps us to understand God's given role to us as his image bearers here on earth. So let's start by recalling the creation narrative here in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And verse 3 here, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. Now, on the second day, God separates the waters above from the waters below. On the third day, God creates the seas and the land. And on the land, it says that he creates vegetation. That's all of our plants and trees of every different kind. On the fourth day, he creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. And now these were set to rule the day and the night, the days and the years, the seasons that go by. On the fifth day, it says that God created the fish and the birds. And he says, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. Now, on the sixth day, it says that God creates two things. The first of which is all of our land creatures. All the creatures here on the land. It specifically says livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth. Then in verse 26, it says, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. This is the story of God's creation and ordering of the world. So what is the biblical narrative claiming right here? That's the key question for us to ask. What is the biblical narrative claiming here? The God created. That's it. I spent way more time than necessary trying to come up with a more grand or eloquent way of saying it, but this is what the author wants us to understand. God created. Now, our Christian worldview is shaped by this belief that God created. That God created ex nihilo is, again, you'll hear me use a lot of Latin things because this is when a lot of this stuff was first put into words. Ex nihilo is another Latin word that means out of nothing. That God created out of nothing. And this is the foundational claim of Christian doctrine. That God, in his sovereignty, created the heavens and the earth and everything in it. Irenaeus, who was this early Christian theologian who you guys don't care about, said it this way. While men indeed cannot make anything out of nothing, but only out of matter already existing, yet God is in this point preeminently superior to men, that he himself called into being the substance of his creation when it previously had no existence. This view implies not only that creation is this free act of God, but that it was good. That God's creative act was good. Okay, I've been talking at a very way up here in the clouds thing. What does this mean for us? Well, it means that God is the source of all that there is. God is the source of all that there is. Now, there are two implications of that for us. The first of which is that God is the creator. This is the nature of God. And this rules out the idea that God created something out of something. Namely, that there was pre-existent matter. And so when we say that God is the creator, we hold that God created something where it didn't exist before. You guys following with me? If he created the world out of pre-existent matter, then he is no greater than we are. Because that is what our creative acts are. They are creating something out of something that already exists. It's repurposing in our creative act. So this truth places God above us as the ultimate creator, as the only one who can bring something out of nothing. Now, the second implication is that God is the sustainer. God is the creator, but he is also the sustainer. And this points to the relationship between God and the world. Since God alone is God, that means that nothing else is eternal, that it doesn't exist outside of relationship with God. Nothing is self-sustaining without God. It owes all of its existence to the sustaining power of God on a second-by-second basis. So we see that God is the source of all that there is, and that means that God is the creator and that God is the sustainer. Let me demonstrate this in this way. We live in a scientific world where our breathing, which sustains our life, is viewed primarily as a scientific reaction that takes place. Oxygen, O2, goes in, and carbon dioxide, CO2, comes out. Now, what happens when we minimize this to a scientific process is that we reason God out of the process. Well, viewing God as the creator and the sustainer of all life changes this from a scientific thing that takes place to a life-sustaining thing. Breathing is no longer a chemical process, but an act of God that sustains our life. He created us and gives us life on a moment-by-moment basis. Every breath we take is due to God's Spirit, which prolongs our life. This is the change of perspective that happens when we begin to view God as the creator. This is what's called a sacramental view of life. It is this understanding and recognizing the creating and sustaining presence of God on a moment-by-moment basis, not just in church, not just in community group, not when we spend time with God alone, but in every moment. It's recognizing God's active presence and movement in every moment of life. So, here is what I propose that you guys do. I want you guys to make your bed every day this week. I want you guys to make your bed every day this week. Not just like throw the covers over it and leave it half made, but make it. Intentionally make your bed every day for 7 days. And I want you guys to make it the very first thing that you do in the morning when you wake up. Make your bed. Before you go make coffee, before you start scrolling on your phone, make your bed. Now, I know that sounds an awful lot like your parents growing up. I mean, in all reality, what's the point? You're just making your bed to unmake it again later in the day, right? It feels pointless. I don't know if any of you guys know Greek mythology. It's like Sisyphus, where he just keeps rolling the rock up the hill, and then it goes back down to the bottom, and then he just goes and rolls, and he spends all of eternity rolling this rock up the hill only for it to fall back down the hill. That's what feel like making your bed feels like. I'm just doing something to undo it at a later point in time, only to have to then redo it again when I wake up. I can assure you that the reason that I'm asking you to do this is not because then your bed will look like one of the Pinterest boards where it's always like perfectly made and their rooms are awesome. But here's what I promise you. If you start making your bed every day, your day will be imprinted differently. Your day will be imprinted differently. Our habits subtly change and form us as human beings. They define who we are and what we are about. So when we make our bed, the first activity of our day, the first move that we make, it is not one of unmade chaos, but is an act as a co-laborer with God. It changes the way that we begin our day every day. In the creation story, God enters into chaos and he creates order and beauty. He creates order and beauty, and in making your bed, you reflect that creative act in the tiniest, most minuscule way. In your small chaos, you make small order. In your small chaos, you make small order, and you recognize and you recall that creation story in the habit of doing it over and over and over again every day, and it begins to form who you are as a human being. Let this act of making your bed become for you a moment of recognizing God as the creator and the sustainer of your life. Making your bed every day is a practice that reacquaints you with your Creator. It teaches us to slow down, to believe that in those small moments, God meets us and He brings meaning to our day. It's not just some meaningless, pointless, never-ending daily task. But this small part of our day becomes profoundly meaningful because it is our site of worship. In making our bed, we train ourselves to live with our eyes open to God's creating and sustaining presence in the midst of our everyday life. So can we do that for 7 days? Just as a community, can we make our bed? Okay, cool. I believe that when we become more aware of our habits, when we become more aware of the ways in which our habits are forming our life, and we orient our habits in a way that reflect the things of God, we begin to understand these profound truths of God as the creator in meaningful, everyday ways. We begin to develop this sacramental lens through which we view our lives, where it's not just a mundane task, but it is a site of our worship. Let me pray. Father God, we thank you, Jesus, that you are the creator, God, that you are the sustainer of life and order in this world. And God, we thank you that that also means that you are present and that you are active in every last piece of it. Father, we praise you, Lord, that you are the creator and the author of life, that you've created these grand things in the world around us that we see, and yet you are mindful of us. As minuscule, tiny human beings, you are mindful of us. God, in this moment, we recognize that you are the source of all that there is, Jesus. We ask you now, God, that you would begin to form us into people who recognize your movement, into people who recognize your presence in an everyday moment. And God, we pray that as we turn our habits over to you, as we surrender our habits to you, meaningless things such as making our bed become profoundly meaningful as we come to a deeper understanding of who you are. So God, we give the rest of this time to you, Jesus, and we respond now in worship. And all God's people said,